The morning of August 16th, 1977, started like any other at Graceland. The sun was just beginning to peek through the windows, casting a warm golden light over the grand mansion. I woke up early, feeling a sense of excitement. Today was a special day. Elvis and I had plans to go for a drive, just the two of us, to a quiet spot where we could talk about our future. We were planning to get married, and I couldn't wait to share every detail with him. I got out of bed and walked to the window, looking out at the lush, green grounds of Graceland. The place was always so peaceful, especially in the early morning. I felt a smile spread across my face, thinking about how lucky I was to be there, to be with Elvis. He had changed my life in ways I never thought possible. I was just a young woman from a small town, and now I was engaged to the king of rock and roll. It was like a dream come true. I put on a simple white dress and a pair of flats, wanting to look casual but pretty for our drive. I headed downstairs, eager to find Elvis and tell him how much I loved him. As I walked through the halls of Graceland, I could hear the soft murmur of voices and the occasional laugh. The house was always alive with the energy of people who loved Elvis as much as I did. I made my way to the kitchen, where I found Elvis's father, Vernon, and his mother, Dodger, sitting at the table, sipping their morning coffee. They smiled at me warmly, and I returned their smiles, feeling a sense of belonging. Vernon and Dodger had always been kind to me, and I felt like they were becoming the family I had always wanted. "Good morning, Ginger," Vernon said, his voice gentle and welcoming. "Elvis should be down soon. He had a bit of a late night, but he's been looking forward to spending time with you." "Thank you, Vernon," I replied, feeling a bit nervous but excited. I can't wait to see him. I decided to wait for Elvis in the living room, where the sunlight streamed in through the large windows. I sat on the couch, my heart beating a little faster with anticipation. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I couldn't wait to tell him about the dreams we had been sharing, the life we were planning to build together. After a few minutes, I heard footsteps on the stairs. My heart leaped, thinking it was Elvis coming down to join me, but it wasn't him. It was one of the staff members, a man named Joe, who looked concerned. "Is everything okay?" I asked, standing up. Joe hesitated for a moment, his face somber. "Ginger, I need you to come upstairs. Something's happened." My heart sank. "What do you mean, what's wrong?" Joe didn't say anything more, just turned and started walking back up the stairs. I followed him, my mind racing with fear. What could have happened? Was Elvis hurt? My hands began to shake as we reached the second floor. Joe led me to the bathroom, and as I stepped inside, my world came crashing down. There, on the floor, was Elvis. He was lying there, motionless, his eyes closed. My breath caught in my throat, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. "Elvis," I cried out, rushing to his side. I dropped to my knees and shook him gently, hoping he would wake up. "Elvis, please, wake up." But he didn't move. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt tears streaming down my face. I looked up at Joe, my voice barely a whisper. "Call 911. Please call 911. Joe nodded and quickly left the room. I stayed by Elvis's side, holding his hand, praying with all my might that he would be okay. The next few minutes felt like an eternity. The sound of sirens grew louder, and soon paramedics rushed into the bathroom. They took over, working to revive Elvis, but I could see the fear in their eyes. I was forced to step back, watching helplessly as they tried to save him. My mind was a blur of confusion and terror. How could this be happening? Just a few hours ago, everything was perfect. Now, my whole world was falling apart. The paramedics continued their efforts, but it was clear that time was running out. Finally, they stopped and one of them turned to me. "I'm sorry, miss. We've done everything we can." I felt like I was in a nightmare, unable to believe what was happening. No, please, you have to keep trying. He can't be gone." But they were already placing him on a stretcher, preparing to take him to the hospital. I followed them, my heart shattered, feeling like I was losing the only person who truly understood me. As we left the bathroom, I saw the worried faces of Vernon, Dodger, and the others. They rushed to me, their eyes filled with tears. "What happened, Ginger? Is Elvis okay?" I couldn't speak. The words were caught in my throat, and all I could do was shake my head. Vernon's face fell, and he put a hand on my shoulder. "We have to stay strong, Ginger. We have to believe he'll be okay." But deep down I knew. I knew that our time together was over, that the man I loved more than anything in the world was gone. The ambulance doors closed, and I was left standing there, feeling like a part of me had died with him. The rest of the morning was a blur. I remember the sound of phones ringing, people rushing around, and the overwhelming sense of loss. I found myself sitting in Dodger's bedroom, surrounded by Elvis's family and friends, all of us praying for a miracle. But as the hours passed, the grim reality set in. Dr. George Nishapoulos, Elvis's personal physician, arrived with a large yellow envelope. He walked over to Vernon and handed it to him, shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice heavy with sorrow. The room fell silent, and I felt a wave of grief wash over me. Elvis was gone, and my world would never be the same again. By the early 1960s, our family had a cozy 3-bedroom, 1-bathroom house in a new suburb of Memphis. Just down the road was a cotton field where an old farmer and his mule still plowed, a reminder of the Old South. As the post-war boom hit, part of the field got paved and a gas station popped up. Soon malls and fast food joints surrounded our home, bringing a new kind of hustle and bustle to our neighborhood. Dad had retired from the Army and was now managing a local department store. Mom worked up the street running a stamp store. They did their best to raise us with good morals and values. We were baptized, and my siblings and I learned to respect others and work hard. During those years, Elvis's fame kept growing. He made more music, starred in movies, got married, and even had a baby. Sometimes, when relatives visited, they wanted to see Graceland. We'd tag along with a security guard in a pink, canopied Jeep for a quick tour of the estate, usually when Elvis was away. I was a bit of a tomboy. I loved roller skating, riding horses, and climbing trees. I'd hop on my brother's motorcycle and pretend to ride it, even though it made Mom and Dad nervous. Mike would sometimes take me for short spins, and I'd feel like the coolest kid in the world. When I turned 14, I really wanted a mini bike. I begged and pleaded, and Dad finally caved. I got my mini bike and spent hours riding it around our neighborhood. My love for motorcycles only grew stronger as the years went by, but my biggest passion was art. I was always drawing and painting. My brother Mike was a fantastic artist and took art classes in college. He was my hero. In high school, I had an amazing art teacher, Mrs. Murphy. She was a character always dressed in purple, with purple eyeglasses and a purple cane. Even her silvery white hair seemed to have a purple tinge. Art was my way of expressing myself, and by my teens I was seriously thinking about turning it into a career. I also loved to sing. I'd pretend my hairbrush was a microphone, put on one of Mom's old skirts, and sing along with the records. Music was a big part of our home. Mom was a self-taught musician who could play the piano, guitar, and mandolin. Her dad had been a minister in a small church in Arkansas, and both of my grandparents had a big spiritual influence on her. So Mom often played gospel hymns on our piano, filling the house with beautiful music. Elvis's presence in Memphis was like a constant reminder that anything was possible. Even though he was a superstar, he was still one of us, a Memphian through and through. His story was a source of pride for our whole city, and it made me feel like I could chase my dreams too. That summer night in 1976, my mom, Sister Rosemary, and I were in for a once-in-a-lifetime experience. We had tickets to see Elvis Presley perform at the Mid-South Coliseum in Memphis. I didn't own any Elvis albums, but I'd grown up hearing his music. My mom had his gospel and Christmas records, and my brother Mike had a few of Elvis's Sun Label 45s. I loved a mix of music, from Fleetwood Mac and Led Zeppelin to classical and rock and roll. But nothing could prepare me for seeing Elvis live. The crowd was a mix of people, middle-aged adults, teens, and kids. When Elvis walked onto the stage, dressed in a white jumpsuit with an Egyptian bird design, blue silk puff sleeves, and a matching belt with chains, I was completely mesmerized. He looked a bit heavier and his hair was longer, but the way he strutted and sang was just as magical as I'd always imagined. He performed That's All Right Mama, the song that started it all in Memphis, and proved to everyone that he was still the king. My mom, sister, and I were three of thousands, but we were all captivated by the show that would turn out to be Elvis's last in Memphis. A few months later, in early September, Terry went to Atlantic City to represent Tennessee in the Miss America pageant. We all went to support her. Terry was a gifted pianist, and had won honors in the swimsuit, talent, and evening gown competitions. Though she didn't win the crown, she was always a winner in my eyes. Before the pageant, I had won Miss Mid-South Fair, a big 2-week event in Memphis. I spent the following days as the official hostess, and it was a blast. But by the end of October, the fair was over, and life went back to normal. One Friday night, November 19th, 1976, my sisters and I were at home with Larry, a guy I had been seeing. The phone rang, and our mom answered it in the kitchen. She came back to the den, looking stunned, and said, "George Klein is on the phone for Terry." George Klein was a famous local disc jockey, and a close friend of Elvis's. Terry went to the kitchen to take the call, and my sister Rosemary and I followed to eavesdrop. George told Terry that Elvis wanted to meet the new Miss Tennessee, and was inviting her to Graceland. Terry, who had been dating someone for a while, accepted the invitation, but we could tell she felt a bit nervous about going alone. Rosemary, being the bold one, whispered to Terry, "Ask if Ginger and I can come too." Terry hesitated, but asked George. After a brief pause, she nodded, and we were in. Larry didn't like the idea of me going, but he understood how excited we were. We were supposed to arrive at Graceland at 11 p.m. We got ready, feeling a mix of excitement and nerves. Terry said she would drive, and George needed to know what car to look for. By 10:30, we were saying goodbye to our parents and heading out. The drive to Graceland was tense, but we chatted to keep our nerves at bay. As we turned onto Elvis Presley Boulevard, we grew quiet, and the fieldstone wall surrounding Graceland came into view. The wrought iron gates with Elvis's image slowly opened, and we drove up the long driveway. We parked and sat in the car for a moment, unsure of what to do next. A security guard appeared and told us to knock on the front door. We laughed at ourselves and the guard's comment, then walked up the stone steps to the front porch. Rosemary, being the bravest, pressed the doorbell. I hung back, still worried about showing up uninvited. When the door opened, George Klein greeted us. I was surprised. I had expected Elvis to answer. George introduced himself and invited us in. I took a deep breath and stepped into Graceland, feeling like I was entering a whole new world. The house was even more beautiful and grand than I had imagined. George led us through the living room, and we marveled at the memorabilia and the famous jungle room. Terry and Rosemary were just as amazed as I was. We couldn't believe we were actually inside Graceland, and the best part was yet to come. We were about to meet Elvis Presley. My feet sank into the plush, red shag carpet as George led us into the foyer. The carpet stretched up the staircase, which was adorned with a gold and white banister. As we passed under a massive, ornate crystal chandelier, I glimpsed a room decorated entirely in red, with French provincial furniture and peacock-stained glass windows. The room was opulent, and though many people found it gaudy, it left a lasting impression on me. We entered the dining room, and I heard voices to my left. I turned to see a group of people sitting around a mirrored table in red, silver-studded, high-backed chairs. Cigar smoke curled into the air. My eyes were drawn to the chair at the end of the table, its back to us. I held my breath, thinking, this must be Elvis, but I was wrong. George introduced the man in the chair as Gigi Gamble, and his wife, Elvis's cousin Patsy Presley, was there too, along with another cousin, Billy Smith, and his wife, Jo. They were all casually dressed, playing cards and smoking cigars. Everyone greeted us warmly, but their quick, appraising looks made me feel a bit nervous. We had dressed nicely to meet Elvis, but hadn't tried too hard to impress. George then led us through the kitchen, which was carpeted in a multicolor patchwork design. The dark brown cabinets and stained glass lamps gave the room a warm, cozy feel. The kitchen opened into a den, which George called the jungle room. The jungle room was unlike any den I had ever seen. Water trickled down a stone-covered back wall, and the furniture featured carved animal heads and engravings. George paused to answer a green phone, buzzing on a nearby table. I heard laughter from the dining room and felt a bit more relaxed. I sat on a faux fur chair with wooden arms carved like dragon heads, while Rosemary and Terry chose a matching couch. The room was filled with statues of jungle animals, a large mirror framed with feathers, and green carpet that covered parts of the ceiling as well as the floor. After a few minutes, a maid entered and offered us drinks. We asked for sodas, and when she left, we joked around, using our mirrored compacts to pretend to primp. Suddenly, I noticed cameras mounted on the walls near the ceiling, aimed at us. I quickly closed my compact and pointed them out to my sisters, feeling mortified. The maid returned with our drinks, and we sat quietly, now cautious of our every move. The house seemed surprisingly active. Phones buzzed, and various people came and went. A young man with long blonde hair introduced himself as Elvis's brother, Ricky Stanley. I was puzzled because I didn't know Elvis had any siblings. Later, I learned that Ricky was Elvis's stepbrother. He worked as an aide to Elvis, and we introduced ourselves. A short, dark-haired man in his 40s appeared and introduced himself as Charlie Hodge. He had a drink in one hand and a cigarette in the other, leaning as if on a healing ship. He told off color jokes, and I thought he was Elvis's court jester. I wondered if he was there to entertain us. George returned and said, "Elvis is still practicing karate. Would you like to see downstairs?" I was surprised because I thought we were already downstairs. We followed him down a staircase at the back of the den and entered a colorful room with blue, red, and yellow fabric lining the walls and ceiling. The furniture matched the vibrant patterns, and there was an electric organ and a billiard table in the center of the room. Next, George took us into the TV room, which was filled with mirrors. Mirrors covered the ceiling, framed the fireplace, and were on the coffee table. Small mirrors sparkled in the embroidered fabric of the yellow and white pillows on a large navy sectional sofa. Yellow leather stools were at the bar, and 3 television sets were built into a side wall. A huge white lightning bolt, symbolizing TCB taking care of business, was painted above the couch. A phone buzzed and George answered it. He said we were going upstairs next, to Elvis's daughter's room. My heart began to race. We passed the dining room again, and I glanced at my watch. It was almost 1. 2 hours had passed, and I began to wonder if Elvis had changed his mind about meeting us. But then, as we entered Lisa's room, I saw Elvis in the doorway. Elvis's jet black hair was casually styled, and he wore a dark blue karate top, black pants, and boots. He looked stunning. He shook our hands, correctly acknowledging each of us by name. He sat in a large dark chair, put a cigar to his lips, and apologized for keeping us waiting. He talked to Terry about her music and her titles, then turned to me. "Have you won any titles?" he asked. I told him a little about myself, and when he got to Rosemary, she mentioned she had never entered any pageants outside of high school. He smiled and said, "Well, you should have, but for now you'll just have to be misunderstood." We all laughed, and I felt at ease with his down-to-earth nature and sexy smile. Elvis talked about the street name changed to Elvis Presley Boulevard and his karate skills. I mentioned I had wanted to take karate lessons when I was 16, but my parents thought I was too young. He disagreed, saying it was never too young to start. We continued to chat, and Elvis's humor and energy captivated me. Suddenly he tilted his head, looked at the floor, and said, "Ginger, you're burning a hole right through me." I was embarrassed and didn't know what he meant. We talked a little more, and then Elvis asked if we wanted to see the rest of the upstairs. Thrilled, we said yes. We followed Elvis, along with Ricky and George, out into the hall. I was still holding my unfinished soda, and Elvis took a sip from it and handed it back to me. This distracted me so much that I made a wrong turn toward the front stairs. Elvis gently guided me back through a set of double doors. We entered his master bedroom, and the first thing I noticed was that the furniture looked like the furniture in our den at home. The room was unique, with a shiny black Naugahyde headboard on a massive bed, reading lamps on either side, red shag carpet, and black and gold wallpaper. The bedroom doors and ceiling were padded, and there were 2 television sets embedded in the ceiling. Elvis explained the padding helped block out noise when he slept. We then went into his office, which was decorated in tans and browns. A glass case filled with rifles and handguns stood on my left, and 2 couches faced each other with a coffee table between them. Near the back was a large desk and 2 bookcases. Elvis walked over to an electric organ and sat down. I stood behind him, and my sisters gathered around. He began to sing "You'll Never Walk Alone," looking up and smiling at us. I felt like I was dreaming. Elvis finished and we applauded. He said, "I'd like to show you my dressing area." I was surprised but thrilled. We followed him back through his bedroom and into his bathroom, carpeted in the same red shag. The bathroom had a black commode with a phone, a black vanity covered with toiletries, and a mirrored wall with makeup lights. Beyond an enormous, curved shower, we entered his dressing area, filled with racks of clothing, a bed covered in faux fur, and a bust of Apollo on a pedestal. Elvis showed us his stage jumpsuits and casual clothes, explaining the workmanship and materials. I was amazed by the personal touch and the glimpse into Elvis's life. The night was unforgettable, and I felt a strong connection to him. As we explored his home, I realized that this was just the beginning of a journey that would change my life forever. The night at Graceland was a whirlwind of emotions. After Elvis excused himself, my sisters and I were left alone in his closet, trying to make sense of what had just happened. We talked quietly, thinking the show was over and we'd be asked to leave soon. But then George came back and said, "Ginger, Elvis wants to see you for a minute." My heart skipped a beat. What did Elvis want with me? I glanced at Terry and Rosemary, unsure of what to do. "He's waiting for you," George urged, motioning me toward the front of the bathroom. My anxiety flared up. My sisters had been my safety net all night, but now I was on my own. I took a few steps forward and turned back to see George guiding my sisters out through the door by the dressing area. My heart pounded as I stepped past the bathroom doorway and saw Elvis sitting on the side of his bed. He smiled and patted the red bedspread, motioning for me to sit down next to him. I nervously walked over and sat down. "Did you notice I was paying more attention to you than to your sisters?" he asked with a faint smile. I looked away, my heart racing. Could it be that Elvis was actually hitting on me? I remembered his comment about me burning a hole through him, how he'd taken a sip from my glass of soda, and the way he'd placed his hands on my shoulders in the hallway. "Yeah, I did," I replied, not sure what to think. Elvis nodded. "When I like someone, I really like them a lot," he said. "It's not just a fling. I don't like one-night stands." I wanted him to know I wasn't that kind of girl. "I don't like one-night stands either," I replied. Elvis looked at me silently for a moment, then pointed to the window. "I'm not that street out there," he said. "If you cut me, I bleed." I wasn't sure what to say, so I just nodded. "Good," he replied. Elvis then picked up a book from the floor, the Book of Numbers by Chero. "When's your birthday?" he asked. "November 13th, I answered. "You're a number 4, he said, adding the 1 and 3 together. He put on a pair of glasses and started reading to me about the number 4. He told me that 4s are sensitive and get their feelings hurt easily. They often feel lonely and isolated, but they are very loyal to their few real friends. I was surprised. I didn't feel lonely, but I was definitely shy, sensitive, and loyal to my friends. Elvis seemed passionate about numerology, and I found myself drawn into it. He told me his birthday was January 8th, making him a number 8. He read about 8s, explaining that they are often misunderstood and feel lonely. They usually play important roles in life, but their success is often recognized only after they're gone. I was amazed. Some of the characteristics really seemed to fit Elvis, but I found it hard to believe he felt lonely. Elvis then picked up another, larger book, and showed me a drawing of a man with a long white beard sitting on a throne. "This is supposed to be an illustration of God," he said. The book reminded me of the illustrated Bible my mom used to read to us when we were younger. Elvis settled back on the bed and motioned for me to sit next to him. I scooted up, feeling more comfortable. He handed me the book and asked me to read aloud. I did, feeling shy, but trying not to make a mistake. Elvis watched me closely, sipping ice water from a glass jar on his night table. The air conditioner made me cold, but I didn't want to ask him to turn it down. We took turns reading and talking into the early morning. Elvis went into the bathroom, and I realized how late it was. I was starting to feel overwhelmed by fatigue and worried about my parents and sisters. When Elvis came back, I said, "Elvis, I should find my sisters and leave. It's really late." "They've already gone," he said casually. "Your sisters went home earlier." I was stunned. They'd left without me. I wondered how he knew. Had he arranged this with George? "Someone will take you home when you're ready," Elvis added, noticing my confusion. I decided it was time to go and thanked him for the night. He moved to the edge of the bed and picked up a phone, asking someone to give me a ride home. He added, "Please be sure and get her number," before hanging up. Then he turned to me and said, "You should always politely ask someone to do something for you. Never tell a person what to do." I nodded, still in shock. Elvis took a pen and a matchbook from the drawer, opened the matchbook, and asked for my phone number. I gave it to him, and he wrote it down. He then leaned in and gave me a quick, light kiss on the lips. I was stunned and excited. I walked out of Graceland in a daze. On the ride home with Steve Smith, I went over the kiss in my mind. I wasn't a seasoned pro, but I hoped Elvis had liked kissing me. When I got home, my family was waiting. They were worried because so much time had passed without any word from us. Terry explained that George had taken them to a racquetball court, and Charlie and Ricky joined them for a tour. George then told them that Elvis wanted to spend more time with me, and that they could wait or leave. They decided to leave, and George assured them I would be safe. I filled them in on the night, leaving out the kiss. I was exhausted but couldn't stop thinking about Elvis. He was different from anyone I'd ever met. He was polite, funny, and sincere. I felt an intense attraction to him and hoped he would call me again. The next day, I woke up thinking about the night. I hoped I would get the chance to know Elvis better. Around 8 p.m., the phone rang and my mom handed it to me. It was George. "Elvis would like you to come over," he said. "I'll drive by and pick you up." I was excited and a little nervous. I wondered why Elvis hadn't called me himself, but I was thrilled he was thinking about me. George picked me up, and we chatted on the way to Graceland. When we got there, he led me straight to the master bedroom and left. Elvis was sitting on his bed, watching TV. He wore a navy jumpsuit and a black rhinestone belt with chains. He greeted me with a smile, and I felt relieved that the night before wasn't a dream. He turned off the TV and said, "You know, television destroys the art of conversation." We talked about music, and I told him about the hymns my mom played. He asked me to follow him to his office and played "In the Garden" on the organ for me. His voice was so soulful and tender. I felt calmed and comforted. We went back to his bedroom, and he started talking about his Ferrari, the Black Mamba. He said it was the fastest snake in the world, and that the car was too fast for me. I thought it was his way of letting me know he liked to be in control. We read more numerology together, and I found it interesting. Elvis seemed to enjoy teaching, and I listened closely. He then mentioned his Stutz Blackhawk and said he wanted to take me for a ride to Memphis Aero to see his airplane. He even invited some cousins along. I was excited as Elvis made a few phone calls to set everything up. I wondered if he, like me, sometimes needed a safety net. The night was just beginning, and I was eager to see where it would lead. When Elvis went into his bathroom, I sat on his bed, looking around the room. I noticed some antihistamine bottles, a box of tissues, and 2 phones on his nightstand. There was a closed-circuit TV monitor nearby, but it was off. I wondered if Elvis had been watching my sisters and me the night before, but I never saw it turned on. On the wall opposite the bed, there was a TV with a Betamax tape player on top. To the left, a bookcase held a record player, radio, and some Betamax tapes. On top of the bookcase were a couple of framed photos of a woman I recognized from movie magazines, Linda Thompson. I remembered her name and wondered why her photos were still in Elvis's room. I didn't have much time to think about it. Elvis came out of the bathroom, now dressed in a coat, and said, "You know, last night while I was practicing karate, George came up to me and said, 'Terry is very nice and Rosemary is very nice, but Ginger.'" He paused, shaking his head. Then Ricky came in later, saying, "Man, I think you're gonna like Ginger." Elvis's voice was sarcastic as he continued. "I told Ricky that I'd had a lot of girls brought up to Graceland in the past few weeks. And yeah, I'm sure I'm gonna find someone I really like in Memphis on a Friday night." He added that his cousin Billy's wife, Jo, had told him, "There's someone down here you are going to like." I felt flattered but a bit uncomfortable. I realized my initial feeling that we were being scrutinized was right. It was after midnight by the time we went downstairs. In the foyer, I saw 2 bodyguards and Gigi and his wife, Patsy. We walked out onto the front porch, and I nearly gasped when I saw Elvis's Stutz Blackhawk. It was a beautiful black car with chrome trim, exhaust side pipes, and wire wheels. I wondered if this was why he hadn't wanted me to ride in his Ferrari first. Elvis opened the passenger door for me, pointing out that the trim on the dash and throughout the car was plated in 18-karat gold. Patsy and Gigi got into the back seat, and I slid into the red leather passenger bucket seat. Elvis got behind the wheel, started the engine, and we drove down the driveway with his bodyguards following in another car. The streets were quiet as we headed toward the airport. It was about 15 minutes away, and as we neared it, Patsy suggested we take a tour over Memphis in Elvis's plane. "Let's fly over Nashville," Elvis quickly said. I didn't say anything. The idea of a short flight in his private plane was exciting, especially since I had only flown commercially once, when I was 13. At Memphis Aero, Elvis's Lockheed Jetstar stood alone on the tarmac. Its interior lights were on, the door was open, and the steps were down. I followed Elvis into the plane, where he introduced me to the pilot, Milo High, and his co-pilot, George. Patsy and Gigi took a seat on a lime-colored couch, and I followed Elvis down the aisle past yellow chairs facing each other with small tables between them. I chose a lime-colored chair in the back, and Elvis's bodyguards sat nearby. I expected Elvis to sit down near me, but he went to the front and started talking to Milo. After a few moments, he looked back at me and said, "I forgot something." He left the plane with his bodyguards, and I stayed in my chair, making small talk with Patsy and Gigi. They acted like this was just another ordinary night, and I got the feeling that impulsive outings with Elvis were common for them. Elvis and his bodyguards returned, and he walked down the aisle with a mischievous grin. He sat down in the chair opposite mine, and the plane's door closed. The engines fired up, and as we began to taxi, Elvis announced that he had gone to get pajamas for everyone, and we were all going to Las Vegas. Las Vegas pajamas. I had never been out west, and I had never spontaneously left with anyone on a trip, especially not with a man I just met. How long would it take us to get there? How long would we be gone? Where would I sleep? I felt like a kid, but I wanted to call home to let my family know what was happening. When Elvis asked if this plan was okay, I simply smiled and said yes. I was silent as we took off, gazing out the window, my mind racing. Elvis was watching me, and I could see him turn his head when I looked at him. The cabin stayed quiet until a while into the flight, when Elvis said, "I would like to see Ginger in new clothes and jewelry." He stood up, went to the rear of the plane, and returned with a small, worn black square case. He placed it on the table, opened it, and took out a long necklace made of black plastic beads with a cross at the center. "Lean forward, Ginger," he said, and gently placed the necklace over my head. "Thank you," I said. "Hold out your wrist and close your eyes," he said. I felt something slip over my hand. Opening my eyes, I was shocked to see a gold identification bracelet on my arm with Elvis written in sparkling diamonds. "That's better," he said. "Now everyone will know you belong to me." I felt stunned and unsettled, but also special. I was more excited than apprehensive and falling in like with Elvis. Later, when I took the bracelet off, I noticed a date inscribed on the back, 1963. It wasn't until after Elvis passed away that I learned he had worn this bracelet for many years before giving it to me. Sandwiches were passed around, but I was too overwhelmed to eat. The lights were dimmed so everyone could rest, but I was too keyed up to sleep. I sat with my eyes closed, wondering what lay ahead. My concerns eventually gave way to excitement, as I thought about seeing Las Vegas. As we neared the end of the flight, Elvis asked me to follow him to the cockpit. I stood next to him, looking through the windshield at the lights below. He slipped his arm around my waist. "Isn't it beautiful?" he whispered. In the distance, the lights of Las Vegas looked like an island of tiny shimmering diamonds. "Yes," I replied, as it was truly breathtaking. We landed at the Hughes Air Terminal. A dark-haired man in his late 30s greeted us. Elvis introduced him as Dr. Elias Gainham, his friend and personal physician. The two of us joined Dr. Gainham in his car, and Elvis's cousins and bodyguards followed in another. Riding through the streets of Las Vegas, I felt like I was in a dream. The city's lights were mesmerizing. I couldn't believe I was really there. We drove to the back of the Hilton International Hotel. entered the building, and took an elevator up to one of the rooms. Elvis's bodyguards brought in a suitcase and left after making sure everything was secure. I sat next to Elvis on the bed as he chatted with his cousins and Dr. Gainham. I learned that Elvis and Patsy were double first cousins. Her father, Vester, who worked as a guard at Graceland's gates, was Elvis's dad's brother, and Patsy's mother, Clet Smith, was Elvis's mom's sister. After a while, Patsy and Gigi left, and Elvis continued talking with Dr. Gainham. Their conversation turned to vitamins. Elvis mentioned that he got vitamin B12 shots regularly. I told him my mother had gotten them from a neighbor who was a nurse. Dr. Gainham offered to give each of us a shot. I was hesitant but trusted him. Elvis and I each got a shot in the arm. When Dr. Gainham left, I expected Elvis and I would go out, but he turned on the TV and settled down on the bed. I was surprised, but we were having fun talking about things on TV. Elvis went into the bathroom and returned wearing blue pajamas. Just as I got used to that, he held out a matching pair of pajamas for me. I was shy about wearing pajamas in front of a man. I didn't know and worried about what it might mean. I hesitated but trusted my instincts and followed his lead. I went into the bathroom and slowly undressed, my fingers trembling a little. When I came out, I felt I should at least tell my parents where I was. I asked if I could call home. Elvis understood, and I phoned our house, waking my mother. When I told her where I was, she was shocked. I was explaining how the trip came about, when Elvis motioned for me to hand him the phone. He spoke with my mother, calling her ma'am, and assuring her he would take good care of me and see me home soon. Elvis settled under the covers and continued to watch TV while I finished saying goodbye. When I hung up, he took my hand and I felt uneasy. I wasn't ready to be intimate with him, but he didn't make a move beyond holding my hand. I relaxed and lay back beside him, watching TV. We fell asleep holding hands as daylight peeked through the curtains. When I woke up, Elvis ordered room service. Gigi brought in the food, laid a towel on the bed, and placed trays with our food on top. We ate, talked, and watched TV. After finishing, I went to the window and pulled the curtains aside. The lights of Las Vegas were shining brightly. I went into the bathroom and changed back into my clothes. When I came out, Elvis was on the phone, arranging our return to Memphis. I wondered if I had done something wrong. It seemed odd to fly all the way to Las Vegas without seeing the city. Maybe he had to get back for work, or maybe he just needed a change of scenery. I consoled myself with the thought that I had gotten to spend more time with Elvis. I had flown on his plane and received beautiful gifts, and he had remained a gentleman. We reconnected with his cousins, and what started as a Saturday night date lasted until our return to Memphis in the early hours of Monday, November 22nd. We drove back from the airport to Graceland, where Elvis asked me to stay for a while. I followed him up to his bedroom where he sat on the bed, turned on the TV, and started flipping through channels. He stopped when a newscaster reminded us. It was the anniversary of John F. Kennedy's death. Elvis talked briefly about the assassination, thinking many were involved, and then moved on to talk about self-defense. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Elvis. The way he leaned over his bed and pulled out that Colt, .45 with the turquoise handle, the E and P on the sides, made my heart race. I'd never seen a gun up close before, and it was a bit scary. But Elvis seemed so proud of it, explaining it was for protection. He told me about a threatening letter he got while getting ready for a show in Las Vegas. His dad had been really worried, but Elvis said, the show must go on. He also mentioned a time when 3 thugs tried to attack him on stage, and he used karate to defend himself. I could tell he'd been through a lot, and it made me appreciate him even more. Just as I was starting to feel a bit overwhelmed by all the stories, the phone on Elvis's bedside table lit up. He answered it with a serious look. It was his cousin Harold, the guard at the front gate, saying that Jerry Lee Lewis was there to see him. I was surprised because I'd always thought Jerry Lee was a cool musician, but Elvis seemed hesitant. He's a great piano player, but he's crazy, Elvis said. He told Harold to tell Jerry Lee he wasn't available. I was a bit disappointed, but also curious about what Elvis thought of him. After a while, I felt tired and knew I needed to go home. Elvis surprised me by asking if I wanted to go on tour with him. I was thrilled and said yes right away. He kissed me lightly on the cheek, and I found it hard to say goodbye. Instead, I said, "I'll see you later," hoping it meant we'd meet again soon. The next day I tried to act normal at work, but my mind was still on Elvis. When my friend Terry came by that evening, I couldn't keep it in anymore. I told her everything and she was amazed. I was still in disbelief myself. On Tuesday, I heard on the news that Jerry Lee Lewis had been arrested outside Graceland. He had tried to see Elvis again, but this time with a gun. It made me realize how serious things could get, and I understood why Elvis didn't want to see him. By Wednesday, I was starting to worry. Elvis hadn't called, and I wondered if I had misread our time together. I even had a talk with Larry, the guy I'd been dating, and told him about Elvis. It was tough, but I felt I needed to be honest. Thanksgiving came and went, and I still hadn't heard from Elvis. I was starting to feel like maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then on the Saturday after Thanksgiving, Elvis's road manager, Joe Esposito, called. He said Elvis was on tour in San Francisco and wanted me to fly there to see a show. I was so relieved and excited. I quickly packed, and my friend Terry helped me with some clothes. The night was cold and snowy, and my parents were worried. Just as I was about to leave, Elvis's pilot, Milo, called and said the plane door was frozen shut. I was worried we might not make the trip, but a few hours later, Milo called back and said we were ready to go. I said goodbye to my dad and hurried to the plane. The flight was long and cold, but I was too excited to sleep. When we landed in San Francisco, it was past midnight. I was taken to a hotel, and I called my parents to let them know I was safe. I unpacked and waited, expecting Elvis to call or knock on my door. But the hours went by and I didn't hear anything. I was starting to feel a bit abandoned. Finally, around 6 p.m., one of Elvis's employees called and said I could order room service. I was hungry, so I ordered food. Later that night, there was a knock on my door. It was Jerry Schilling, who told me I was moving to a different room. I was confused but figured I had time to pack. A few minutes later, Jerry and Joe Esposito came back and led me to a new room. When I walked in, there was Elvis, sitting on a couch in a blue terry cloth robe. He was surrounded by men, and I felt a bit uncomfortable. But when our eyes met, I forgot about everything else. All the waiting and uncertainty were worth it just to see him again. Elvis seemed at ease as he stood up with a smile and walked over to give me a hug. He then turned to the group of strangers and started making introductions. There was Larry Geller, his hairdresser, a lean man in his late 30s, Billy Stanley, Elvis's stepbrother, who was in his 20s and worked as an aide, Ed Parker, a strongly built Hawaiian man in his mid-40s with thick silver hair, who had trained Elvis in karate, Dr. George Nishapoulos, Elvis's silver-haired physician in his late 40s, and his son Dean, and Al Strada, also in his 20s, another aide. Lastly, there was Lamar Fike, an overweight man in his early 40s with salt and pepper hair. No one mentioned what Lamar did, so I wondered if he was part of Elvis's team or just visiting. Elvis took my hand and led me into the suite's adjoining bedroom. He didn't explain why I hadn't heard from him or seen him until now, but I didn't care. My confusion and feeling of being left out vanished the moment I saw him. The room was filled with books scattered everywhere on the bed, on the floor, and even spilling out of suitcases. Some of the titles looked familiar, dealing with religious philosophy and numerology, just like the books in his bedroom at Graceland. Seeing all these books, I realized that Elvis was on a serious personal quest. We sat on his bed and talked about my trip, what he'd been reading, and other things. He told me he had a show the next night, and I wondered if he'd had one tonight. Elvis wasn't interested in talking about his shows, though. He wanted to look through his books. He started reading to me, pointing out phrases he had underlined and written notes about. I could see that this wasn't just casual reading. He was studying these books in detail. I admired his thirst for knowledge. The bedroom door was slightly open, and I noticed some of the men from earlier still sitting in the living room. It was well after 1 in the morning, and I wondered if these late hours were normal for them. I realized that maybe the late nights were the only time Elvis could truly relax, with the rest of the world asleep. We talked until the early morning hours. When we were both exhausted, Elvis told me I had a separate room, adjoining the living room suite. He escorted me across the now empty living room, and said he would see me later that afternoon. He gave me a light kiss, and headed back to his bedroom. I entered my new, larger room and saw that my suitcase had been placed inside. I opened it, took out my pajamas, and walked into a generous bathroom with paisley wallpaper. There was a telephone attached to the wall above the toilet, which seemed like a small touch of luxury to me. I settled into bed, amazed at how quickly my life had changed. I was bone-tired from the trip and the anxiety of waiting to hear from Elvis. My head barely hit the pillow before I fell into a deep sleep. I was jolted awake at 4 p.m. by a loud knock on my door. "Breakfast," someone announced. It was a bit late for breakfast, but I was in Elvis's world now, living by his time zone. I quickly dressed, put on some makeup, and entered the suite's living room. Elvis's bedroom door opened, and he joined me, still in pajamas and a blue hooded robe. For the first time, we sat together on a couch instead of a bed. One of Elvis's aides spread a towel across the coffee table and placed 2 plates of Southwestern omelets, bacon, coffee, and juice in front of us. The TV was on, and Elvis and I chatted as we ate. Soon, some of the men I'd met the night before began filtering into the room. They all wore the same gold necklace with the TCB lightning bolt emblem, so I guessed they were part of a special group associated with Elvis. As we ate, I saw more of Elvis's sharp sense of humor. He lit up a cigar and started joking around with the guys. He found some things on TV amusing and made funny comments as he surfed through various channels. The conversation became animated, and Elvis's talk was peppered with curse words. I thought this was just his way of talking around the guys, and as our relationship grew, I learned to overlook it, even though I was never fully comfortable with it. Elvis and the men continued to pal around while I ate quietly. When I finished, I stood to go to the bathroom. Elvis grabbed my hand. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Just to wash my hands," I replied. "Okay, hurry back," he said. I was flattered. Elvis was so engaged with his entourage that I thought he wouldn't notice if I slipped out for a few minutes. But he was still focused on me, and my presence was important to him. As the time for Elvis's show drew near, he went into his bedroom to get ready, and I dressed in mine. When I returned to the living room, there was a buzz of activity. Aides, the hairdresser, the physician, the road manager, and bodyguards were all rushing in and out of his bedroom. Before long, Elvis stepped out of his room in a white jumpsuit with a rainbow pattern of blue swirled across the front and down the sides of his pants. His hair was styled perfectly, and he wore a matching belt with chains around his waist and white leather boots. Seeing him dressed for the stage up close, he looked so handsome, it took my breath away. Elvis glanced over at me with a faint smile, placing his hands on his belt and shifting it up a bit. He raised an eyebrow and gave me a slightly worried look. I couldn't believe Elvis was showing a hint of anxiety before a performance after so many years. It endeared him to me even more. I mouthed very nice to him, wanting him to know I thought he looked great. We left the room and walked down the hotel corridor. Elvis grew quiet, focused on his upcoming show. We took the elevator down to the ground floor, where a couple of cars and a limousine were waiting with a police escort. Climbing into the limo was a new experience for me. I scooted into the center of the back seat, and Elvis sat beside me. Some of the other men crowded in with us, while others got into the second car. Elvis was still anxious about his performance. He stared out the window, occasionally making small talk or a joke, but speaking softly. He explained, "I'm protecting my voice." We arrived at the Cow Palace Arena in Dolly City, and everything moved quickly. We exited the car, and Elvis was rushed into a dressing room. I was escorted past backstage hands and told to wait by the stage. The arena was full, and a comic named Jackie Kahane was performing as the opening act. I stood alone, feeling excited and a little scared. I thought about how lucky I was to be there, about to watch his show from a guest's perspective. Dean Nishapoulos approached and handed me a soft drink, then brought over a steel chair. Elvis wanted it placed right on stage behind his soundman. I was thrilled. He wanted me so close to him. "Just make sure you head for the limo at the start of his closing song. Can't help falling in love," Dean warned. "Otherwise, it might be tough to get you out of here when the fans rush the stage at the end of the show." My heart beat faster as I was assisted onto the stage. I met soundmen Felton Jarvis and Bruce Jackson and sat down. Jackie Kahane did a great job warming up the crowd. As his routine wound down, a thrill of anticipation rippled through the audience. I was feeling this excitement intensely, knowing I wasn't just watching Elvis the performer, but a man who made me feel special. The lights dimmed, and the orchestra began playing, Also Sprach Zarathustra. Screams erupted as Elvis strode onto the stage, drawing all eyes to him. He played C.C. Rider with great passion, and the audience was on its feet. Throughout the concert, Elvis seemed to be having fun. He joked with the crowd, his musicians, and the background singers. Charlie Hodge helped with his guitar and handed him water. I watched in alarm as fans tumbled over each other to grab a scarf that Elvis threw into the audience. I was afraid someone might get hurt. As the concert continued, time seemed to suspend. Elvis had been on stage for well over an hour when the band started to play Can't Help Falling in Love. I remembered Dean's warning and stood up, preparing to leave. Suddenly, "Stay," echoed through the speakers. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Elvis pointing at me while continuing to sing. I sat back down, embarrassed, hoping no one else had noticed. I grew increasingly nervous as the seconds ticked by, worried about how I'd make it to the car in time. When I saw Elvis walking to the opposite side of the stage, I jumped up and ran off. The limousine was waiting, its engine running, doors open. Someone led me there just in time, as Elvis came rushing toward the limo, surrounded by his entourage. He climbed in, drenched in sweat, with a towel around his neck. His bodyguards, Dr. Nishapoulos, Joe Esposito, and a few others joined us. Good show, Joe said as Elvis leaned back, wiping his face with the towel. Others began complimenting him. I added, "You were wonderful." As the limousine moved forward, Elvis leaned toward me. "Did you see the very end of the show?" he asked. "No," I admitted. I was told to be in the car before the last song finished. I saw a flash of annoyance on his face. "Be sure Ginger remains seated until the very end of the next show," he announced to everyone in the limo. I smiled, knowing I'd see another one of his shows. Fans mobbed the limo as we emerged from the building. It was scary, with some fans trying to climb on top of the car. I held Elvis's hand, but he seemed calm, used to this attention. He waved to his fans and joked about getting a plastic arm to wave while resting his own. Back at the hotel, Elvis went into his bedroom with his aides and Dr. Nishapoulos. I went into mine. After the men left, Elvis asked for me and ordered room service. I walked into his bedroom and was surprised to see him already in pajamas and a robe. He looked comfortable, but it wasn't that late. Various members of his staff entered, and our food was brought in. While we ate, Elvis began scrutinizing his performance, going over everything: the band, the lighting, the sound, and the audience experience. He didn't want to disappoint his fans in any way. As we talked about the show, it dawned on me that I had entered his suite at around the same time the previous night. He had been dressed in his robe then too, and surrounded by these men. Had he finished a show last night? And if so, why wasn't I invited?